The Elysium space station felt as though it were alive, resonating with a low hum of circulating air. The constant buzz of energy conduits and the sporadic clank of shifting bulkheads to Wyatt Kane was merely another colossal structure orbiting some far-off star. Another location he'd prefer to avoid, he muttered to himself as he navigated through the dimly lit corridors, tapping away at the battered console on his forearm. Damn glitch, he grumbled, scrolling through a jumble of navigation logs. The station's automated systems had been generating errors for days, but no one could identify the cause, and, as one of the few human engineers granted this level of access, it was Wyatt's responsibility to resolve it. Wyatt was skilled at his job, perhaps too skilled, given how frequently his supervisors dispatched him to remote stations like Allium to set things right. What he struggled with was obeying orders, which is why, instead of waiting for an official passcode from the station's overseers, he took matters into his own hands and rerouted his clearance by circumventing the station's access protocols. This should do it, he muttered with a smirk as he entered the final command. The door before him hissed open with a smooth mechanical click, and Wyatt stepped through, still half focused on his arm console. It wasn't until he had taken 3 steps that he looked up and realized he was in the wrong location. The room was nothing like the sterile service corridors he was accustomed to. In fact, it seemed out of place on a space station entirely. A soft, pale light emanated from bioluminescent strips woven into the ceiling, bathing the room in a calming blue glow. It provided an ethereal ambiance, reminiscent of moonlight filtering through deep waters. Delicate hanging drapes in silvery white cascaded from the high ceiling, giving the impression of a sanctuary, private and tranquil. Wyatt froze, staring at the elegant furnishings and high-backed chairs, unsure whether to retreat quietly or continue forward. But before he could decide, something caught his eye. An unfamiliar silhouette in the far corner. She was facing away from him, seated in front of a large concave screen displaying an array of lion symbols he couldn't decipher. But it wasn't the alien technology that made his breath catch. It was her. The alien woman's skin shimmered a soft slate blue, each subtle movement revealing faint frost-like tips along her shoulders and neck. Her dark hair, threaded with streaks of white, cascaded in gentle waves down her back. Every aspect of her appeared regal, otherworldly, and yet strikingly real, as if someone had captured the night sky and given it form. "Who are you?" Her voice sliced through the silence, smooth yet commanding, though she hadn't turned to face him yet. Wyatt felt the weight of her gaze, the way her words reached him like an unspoken warning. He had faced mechanical malfunctions, hostile aliens, and even a rogue cleaning droid that attempted to corner him. But standing there, caught off guard, he could only manage a clumsy response. Hi. He regretted it instantly. The woman turned, her eyes locking onto his. They were a deep, iridescent blue, reflecting the light in the room in shifting shades. She regarded him for a moment, taking in his unkempt hair and the worn utility jumpsuit he wore like a second skin. He felt out of place, like a scruffy dog that had wandered into a queen's ballroom. "This chamber is restricted," she said, her voice sharper this time. "Identify yourself." Wyatt's mind scrambled for words, torn between honesty and an explanation that wouldn't lead to his demise. "Wyatt Kane," he said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I'm an engineer. I was just fixing some navigational errors and the door." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Okay, I opened the wrong door. My mistake." She tilted her head slightly, and despite her cold tone, he noticed something flicker in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps. Not the response he anticipated. "Are you always this careless with security protocols, Wyatt Kane?" she asked, a hint of dry amusement creeping into her voice. Wyatt cleared his throat. "I prefer to think of it as being proactive," he said with a wry grin, though the joke felt flimsy under her gaze. "You know, solving problems before they escalate." The woman stood, and it was then Wyatt realized just how tall she was. Almost a head taller than him. Her presence was commanding, but not aggressive. Her movements were fluid and measured, like watching a ripple move through water. "And what exactly," she continued, "did you hope to accomplish by breaking into the private chambers of Alindra, Queen of the Leon Dominion?" Wyatt's blood ran cold. The Lion Queen. He had heard tales about the Lions, a proud and isolationist race seldom seen outside their territory. The rumors depicted their leaders as aloof and unapproachable. Now here he was, standing in the private chambers of their ruler. His mind screamed at him to apologize, to grovel, and to leave. But for some inexplicable reason, what came out of his mouth was, "Well, now that you mention it, the navigation systems might be less of an issue than the assassin bots lurking in your air ducts." Her eyes narrowed, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Wyatt wondered if he had crossed the line into outright foolishness. Then she raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the edge of her lips. "Assassin bots?" Wyatt nodded earnestly, trying to ignore the knot tightening in his chest. "It's the small things, you know. Duct access panels left unsecured, unexplained power surges, and really, whoever's programming them could use a crash course in subtlety." Endra studied him, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of surprise, maybe even interest. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. His head. "I see," she said, her tone measured. "And I suppose your proactive approach includes offering unsolicited advice to a foreign monarch?" Wyatt opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been told I have a knack for that," he admitted, to his surprise. Elrera chuckled, a soft, almost melodic sound that seemed to lighten the atmosphere around them. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Wyatt Kane," she said. "Perhaps both." He was about to agree when the door behind him slid open, and a pair of lion guards entered, their imposing figures clad in sleek dark armor. They stopped abruptly upon seeing the human in the Queen's chambers, their expressions unreadable beneath their helmets. "Your Highness," one of them spoke, urgency lacing his voice. "The Council is awaiting your presence. Shall we?" Eldora raised a hand, silencing him. She turned her gaze back to Wyatt, her eyes appraising him with an intensity that made him feel like he was under a microscope. "You are an enigma, human," she said softly, almost to herself. "Tell me, why did you not call for help the moment you realized your mistake?" Wyatt considered lying, but something in her tone suggested it wouldn't work. He met her gaze, forcing himself to hold steady. "I guess I figured that if I was going to die for breaking into the wrong room, I'd at least like to know why first," he replied. "And maybe because I wasn't entirely sure you'd kill me." There was a long silence, the kind that seemed to stretch time. The guards shifted uneasily, their attention focused on the Queen, awaiting her command. But Alindra just smiled, an expression both elegant and unsettling in its subtlety. "Now, an engineer who prefers honesty to self-preservation. How very human of you." Wyatt wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or insulted. "Is that a compliment?" She inclined her head, a regal gesture carrying layers of meaning. "An observation?" she said. "You may leave now, Wyatt Kane, but take care. There are places aboard the station where a wrong door may lead to a fate even your wit cannot escape." He exhaled, relief flooding through him. "Understood, Your Highness," he said, making a hasty but polite retreat toward the door. He could feel the guard's eyes boring into his back, but he forced himself to walk calmly. Just before he reached the threshold, Endra spoke again. "One last thing, Wyatt," she said, her voice almost casual. "If you encounter more of these assassin bots in your work, do inform me. I'd prefer to be aware of such threats before they reach my private chambers." Wyatt turned, caught her eye, and grinned despite himself. "Of course, Your Highness. I'll make sure to keep an eye on your ducks." Elra didn't smile, but the corner of her lips twitched ever so slightly, as if the idea amused her. "Good," she said, turning back to her screen. The doors slid shut behind him, and Wyatt let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing with what had just occurred. Of all the wrong doors he could have opened, just another day at the office, he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the adrenaline still buzzing through his veins. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time he found himself in Queen Alindra's presence. And if it was, he wasn't sure if that would be a relief or a disappointment. As he made his way back through the corridors, Wyatt's thoughts were split between the mess he had gotten himself into and the fleeting memory of Alindra's gaze, sharp, calculating, and just a little curious. One thing was certain. He had definitely opened the wrong door, but he couldn't help wondering what might happen if next time he did it on purpose. Wyatt's nerves were still on edge when he reached the maintenance hub, a sprawling room lined with open consoles, half-disassembled panels, and engineers milling about in various states of frustration. The hum of machinery and the low drone of voices created an almost hypnotic ambience, something he usually found oddly comforting. But today, every shadow felt like it was concealing a secret, and every passerby seemed to be watching him a little too closely. He made his way to a cluttered workbench in the corner, dropping his toolkit with a sigh. He didn't know what was more surreal: the fact that he just had a casual conversation with a literal alien queen, or that he wasn't dead for doing so. Well, if it isn't the brave engineer himself," drawled a familiar voice from behind him. Wyatt turned to find Naira standing there, arms crossed, an eyebrow raised in amusement. Naira was a fellow human, and the station's unofficial network security guru. She was tall, wiry, and had an ever-present smirk that Wyatt found alternately reassuring and infuriating. She also had a knack for sniffing out trouble, and Wyatt could tell by her grin that she knew he was neck-deep in it. "I heard you took a little stroll into the restricted zones," Naira said, her voice teasing but her eyes sharp. "Thought you were smarter than that." Wyatt scratched the back of his neck, stalling for time. "I was just doing my job." "Aha," she replied, not buying it for a second. She slid into a seat across from him, resting her elbows on the table. "So what's the story, Wyatt?" Wyatt glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. "You know the restricted section in the southeast quadrant?" Naira snorted. "The one guarded by the Leon Royal Guards and sealed behind biometric locks?" "No, Wyatt, I've never heard of it." "I may have accidentally walked in there," he admitted, cringing. Naira's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Are you insane? You could have been—" "Yeah, thanks for the reminder," Wyatt cut in, shuddering. He had been running on autopilot since the incident, the adrenaline only now starting to wear off. "Look, I didn't mean to. I was rerouting my clearance to access the station's core logs when the door just opened, and the Queen was inside," Naira said flatly, her earlier amusement vanishing, her voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. "This is serious, Wyatt. You could have been executed for trespassing on royal territory." "Except I wasn't," Wyatt replied, the words tumbling out in a rush. She didn't even seem that angry. More curious, if anything. Naira leaned back, considering this. "You've got to be kidding me." "Curious about what?" "Assassin bots," Wyatt said almost reflexively. Naira blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "I may have let slip that someone's been planting illegal tech in the station's ventilation systems," Wyatt admitted, grimacing. "So now she wants me to keep an eye out and let her know if I find any more?" Naira stared at him, her mouth slightly open. Then she laughed. A short, almost incredulous bark. "Let me get this straight," she said, shaking her head. "You accidentally stumble into the Queen's private chambers, spill half your secrets to her, and now you're her informant?" "Basically," Wyatt muttered, slumping forward onto the table. "Yeah," Naira sighed, rubbing her temples as if she had a headache. "Of course it would be you." Later that day, Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than he understood. He had seen Alindra's expression, something about the way her eyes narrowed, the tightness in her voice when she mentioned threats to her chambers. She was worried. And if a queen was worried, then there was more to this station's politics than he'd realized. Unable to focus on his work, Wyatt decided to find out more. He logged into the station's maintenance database, his fingers moving quickly over the console as he accessed restricted sections of the internal security logs. Naira had once described him as recklessly competent, and now he was going to put that reputation to the test. As he scanned the data, one particular log caught his attention. It was a record of unauthorized power surges originating from the maintenance conduits right near the Queen's chambers. They were small, subtle disturbances, but there was a pattern. Someone had been siphoning power for weeks, building up enough energy to power something significant. Wyatt's stomach dropped. He knew enough about Lion technology to recognize this could be the work of an infiltration unit or a covert attack. But why here? Why now? "Someone's planning something," he muttered under his breath, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Talking to yourself again?" came a smooth, unfamiliar voice from behind him. Wyatt jumped, nearly dropping his console. He turned to see a tall lion male leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. The man's slate blue skin marked him as one of Alindra's people, but his eyes were hard and suspicious. He wore the elegant dark robes of a high-ranking official, and his presence set off every warning bell in Wyatt's head. "You're Wyatt Kane, aren't you?" the Lion asked, his voice deceptively polite. "I'm Lord Saren." The name made Wyatt's blood run cold. Saren was the leader of one of the more conservative factions among the Lions, known for opposing the Queen's alliances with humans. The man's reputation for ruthless ambition preceded him. Yes, Wyatt said, straightening up. He tried to look like he wasn't completely out of his depth, which was exactly how he felt. Saren's eyes narrowed slightly. "I hear you've taken a particular interest in our Queen's safety," he said. "How admirable." Wyatt forced a smile. "Just doing my job." "Of course," Saren replied, his tone dripping with false sincerity. He stepped closer, his eyes scrutinizing Wyatt. "I merely came to express my appreciation for your diligence, but I would caution you to tread carefully, Mr. Kane. There are certain matters aboard this station that do not concern outsiders." Wyatt swallowed, feeling the weight of Saren's words. There was a veiled threat there, and they both knew it. "I'll keep that in mind," Wyatt said, trying to keep his voice steady. Saren inclined his head, smiling that thin, predatory smile. "Good. We wouldn't want any unfortunate misunderstandings, would we?" As Saren walked away, Wyatt let out a shaky breath. His instincts screamed at him to get as far away from this mess as possible. But something else, a stubborn, reckless streak he had never quite managed to rein in, kept him rooted to the spot. If Saren was trying to intimidate him, it meant the man was hiding something, and if Wyatt was going to figure out what, he'd have to play this very carefully. Hours later, Wyatt was summoned to a different part of the station, a secluded observation deck overlooking the swirling blue vortex of a nearby gas giant. The view was breathtaking, but Wyatt couldn't appreciate it, not with a knot of tension in his gut. He wasn't alone. Elindra stood there, her posture perfectly still, hands clasped behind her back as she gazed out at the planet below. Wyatt approached cautiously, waiting for her to speak first. "I appreciate your discretion, Wyatt," she said without turning around, "and your honesty." "Figured it was the least I could do," Wyatt replied, forcing a casual tone, "since you didn't have me thrown out an airlock." Elindra's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Indeed." She turned to face him, her expression more guarded than before. "I've been informed of your recent encounter with Lord Saren." Wyatt blinked. "You knew?" "Lord Saren has many eyes and ears aboard this station," Elkra replied, her tone carefully neutral. "It would be foolish of me not to be aware of his movements." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "But I believe you already suspected that." "Yeah," Wyatt admitted. "He's definitely not the friendly type." The Queen's gaze sharpened, her eyes piercing through his casual bravado. "You seem remarkably unafraid of my people, Wyatt Kane." He shrugged, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "I've been around enough star systems to know that people are people, no matter the skin color." Elindra regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and she nodded, as if coming to a decision. "I have a task for you," she said quietly, "one that requires your particular ingenuity." Wyatt felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of task?" "There is a device," Elgra explained, "a transmitter hidden somewhere on this station. Its purpose is to relay confidential communications to our enemies, undermining the Dominion's stability. I believe Lord Saren is using it to manipulate the Council's decisions." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to find it?" Eltra stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Find it, disable it, and bring me proof of its existence. Do this, and you will not only have earned my gratitude, but you will have given me a weapon against Saren's machinations." Wyatt hesitated. It was risky, borderline suicidal even. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected. A flicker of desperation, quickly masked but undeniably real. "You're really in trouble, aren't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Queen's expression hardened, and she straightened, her tone turning icy. "The affairs of my people are not your concern." "Maybe not," Wyatt replied, surprising himself with his own boldness. "But if I'm going to risk my neck for you, I need to know what I'm up against." For a moment he thought she might dismiss him outright, but instead she sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "You are right," Eldra said, her voice softening. "There is much at stake, more than you realize. I am trying to build a future for my people, one where alliances with humans are possible, but there are those who would see that future destroyed."
Wyatt considered this. He wasn't a politician, and he wasn't a hero, but he had never been able to walk away from someone who genuinely needed help. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it.
But if we're going to take down Saren, we're going to need more than just a transmitter. We need proof that he's working against you." Alindra's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something like trust in her gaze. "Then we shall find it together," she replied, "and we will not fail." Wyatt nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a mantle. He didn't know how he had ended up here, in the middle of an interstellar power struggle, with a queen depending on him. But there was no turning back now. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. Wyatt had faced dangerous situations before. A collapsing mining shaft on Europa, a malfunctioning AI on the Nebula Forge, and once, even a diplomatic incident involving a drunken dignitary and a very sharp salad fork. But none of those compared to this. He was standing at the heart of a brewing civil war on a space station that could become a battleground at any moment. And his allies were a secretive queen, and his own tendency to ignore every instinct for self-preservation. Wyatt had slipped back into the maintenance sector, his mind buzzing with Alindra's words. "We shall find it together." That wasn't just an order, it was a promise. A commitment to face whatever came next as partners. He couldn't shake the memory of the fleeting vulnerability he had seen in her eyes, the trace of trust that had replaced her guarded mask. It was strange how much that meant to him. He brushed past Naira, who was sitting at a console with her feet up, absently twirling a stylus between her fingers. She raised an eyebrow as he slid into the chair beside her. "So," she said, eyes still focused on her screen, "decided to tell me what's really going on, or are we sticking with the fixing navigational errors line?" Wyatt sighed. He had learned a long time ago that keeping secrets from Naira was like trying to hide cookies from a hungry dog. Futile, and likely to end with something getting chewed up. "Fine," he muttered, leaning in closer. "There's more to this whole mess than I thought. Someone's using the station to relay sensitive info to an enemy faction, a lion lord named Saren. The Queen wants me to find the transmitter and shut it down." Naira blinked, the stylus freezing mid-twirl. "Saren?" she repeated, her voice dropping. "You mean Lord Saren? As in the guy with half the council in his pocket?" "The same," Wyatt confirmed. Naira let out a low whistle, finally tearing her eyes away from the screen to look at him. "And here I was thinking you were just in over your head. Turns out you're drowning." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Wyatt muttered. Naira narrowed her eyes. "How much does she trust you?" The question caught Wyatt off guard. He wanted to say he didn't know, that he was just a pawn in a much bigger game. But that wouldn't be the truth. "She trusts me enough to ask for my help," Wyatt said quietly. That's got to count for something." Naira studied him for a long moment, and Wyatt could almost see the gears turning behind those sharp eyes. She was about to respond when a notification flashed on her console. A low-priority alert from the station's ventilation systems. Naira frowned, tapping the screen. "Unauthorized access in Sector D4, she read aloud. "Looks like someone's trying to tamper with the power lines again." Wyatt felt his stomach twist. D4? That's right near the council chambers. "Yeah," Naira replied, narrowing her eyes. "And there's only one person on the station who's got clearance to make those kinds of changes." The corridors of Sector D4 were empty and cold, the lights dimmed to minimal power. Wyatt and Naira crept forward, moving as silently as possible through the shadows. Wyatt's heart was pounding in his ears, each beat a reminder of how foolish this plan was. Naira held up a hand, signaling for Wyatt to stop. She crouched beside a maintenance panel, her fingers dancing over the control pad. A faint blue light flickered, indicating an active power drain. "Someone's definitely here," she murmured, barely audible. Before Wyatt could respond, he heard a faint rustling noise. A quiet, but unmistakable sound, like the shifting of cloth against metal. He turned, catching a glimpse of movement in the darkness. A shadow that slipped through the air with unnatural grace. "Company," Wyatt whispered, reaching for the blaster at his hip. But before he could draw, something slammed into him from behind, knocking him to the ground. Wyatt rolled instinctively, raising his arm to block an incoming strike. A figure loomed over him. A lion assassin, their slate-blue skin almost invisible in the dim light. "Wyatt!" Naira shouted, drawing her own weapon. She fired, and the assassin dodged with inhuman speed, the shot grazing their shoulder. They spun around, shifting their focus to Naira, and Wyatt seized his chance. He lunged forward, grabbing the assassin's arm and twisting it sharply. The lion let out a low hiss, but didn't cry out in pain, just turned those emotionless eyes on him. Unblinking and cold, Wyatt drove his knee into their side, forcing them to stumble. Naira took the opening, firing a second shot that hit the assassin square in the chest. The lion crumpled, collapsing into a heap on the floor. Wyatt stood there, breathing heavily, trying to steady his shaking hands. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't cut out for this kind of fight, but here he was, right in the middle of one. "You okay?" Naira asked, lowering her blaster. "Yeah," Wyatt replied, still catching his breath. "You?" Naira smirked. "Better than you, that's for sure." Wyatt managed a weak grin, but the moment of levity was short-lived. He crouched beside the fallen lion, searching their uniform for any sign of identification. There was none. No insignia, no rank markings, just a plain dark uniform marking them as one of Saren's agents. "Great," Wyatt muttered. "Now we've got to figure out what they were doing here." Naira tapped her console, bringing up the schematics for Sector D4. "The power lines lead to a backup relay station," she said. "It's old, barely operational, but if someone wanted to transmit data without going through the main systems, this would be the place to do it." Wyatt felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He glanced at the fallen lion, then back at Naira. "We've got to move now." They found the relay station tucked away behind a series of maintenance hatches. A small, cramped room filled with outdated tech and exposed wiring. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Dust covered the consoles, and the lights flickered sporadically. But the transmitter was there, connected to the station's power grid through a series of improvised cables. "Is that what I think it is?" Naira asked, her voice hushed. "Yeah," Wyatt replied grimly. "And if it's active, Saren's getting everything he needs to undermine the Queen." "Then let's shut it down," Naira said, moving toward the transmitter. "Wait," Wyatt said, grabbing her arm. "If we just destroy it, we lose our proof. Alindra needs evidence to expose Saren's plans." Naira hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, so what do we do?" Wyatt thought for a moment, then started disconnecting the auxiliary power lines. "We leave the main connection intact," he explained, "but we sever the transmission pathways. It'll look like the relay failed on its own. Just old tech breaking down. Saren won't realize it's been tampered with until it's too late." Naira raised an eyebrow. "Not bad, Wyatt. You sure you're just an engineer?" "Spins. I prefer proactive problem solver," Wyatt replied with a grin. Naira rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of relief in her expression. They worked quickly, rerouting the power lines and disabling the transmitter's data pathways. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they could do on short notice. When they finished, Wyatt stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "We've got to get this to Alindra," he said, "before Saren realizes what's happening." But just as he turned toward the door, a soft click echoed through the room, a sound that made Wyatt's blood run cold. He looked up to see two lion guards standing in the doorway, their weapons drawn and aimed at him. "Step away from the transmitter," one of them ordered, their voice cold and emotionless. Wyatt glanced at Naira, then at the guards. His mind raced, searching for a way out. But before he could act, another figure stepped into the room. Lord Saren. The Lion Lord smiled a thin, predatory smile that sent a shiver down Wyatt's spine. "I must say, Mr. Kane," Saren said, his voice smooth and dripping with false courtesy, "you've been quite the nuisance." Wyatt clenched his fists, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just doing my job." Saren's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only cold calculation. "Ah, yes, always the dutiful engineer," he replied. "But you've overstepped, Mr. Kane, and now you've left me with no choice." The guards moved forward, their weapons trained on Wyatt and Naira. Wyatt's mind raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. He needed to stall, to buy time, anything to keep Saren from taking them in. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension, a voice he recognized instantly. "Stand down!" Alindra stepped into the room, her presence commanding and her voice ringing with authority. The guards hesitated, lowering their weapons as she approached, her gaze locked on Saren. "Lord Saren," she said, her tone sharp and unyielding, "you will explain yourself." Saren's smile faded, replaced by a look of barely concealed contempt. "Your Highness," he said, his voice tight with feigned respect, "I was merely investigating reports of sabotage in this sector." Alindra's eyes narrowed. "You lie," she replied, her voice laced with quiet fury. "I know of your schemes, Saren, and I will not allow you to undermine my rule."
For a moment, the tension in the room was suffocating, the silence heavy with unspoken threats. Wyatt stood there, feeling like he was teetering on the edge of a precipice. Then, in a single fluid motion, Alindra drew a slender, curved blade from her belt, a weapon that shimmered with an otherworldly light. She held it with practiced ease, her stance poised and ready. "You have overreached, Saren," she said quietly, "and now you will face the consequences."
Wyatt's heart pounded as he realized what was about to happen. This wasn't just a political standoff. It was a declaration of war, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Wyatt stood frozen, his breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a curse. Alindra's blade gleamed under the flickering lights of the relay room, its sharp edge reflecting 1,000 unspoken threats. She moved like a coiled predator ready to strike, her eyes locked onto Lord Sauron with an intensity that could have melted steel. But Saren didn't flinch. He straightened, his fingers tapping idly against the hilt of a sleek lion's sidearm that hung at his belt. The silence was taut, like a wire pulled to its breaking point, and Wyatt had the sinking feeling that he was watching a powder keg ignite.
"Your Highness,"
Saren said, his voice dripping with feigned civility, "I think we both know the situation is far more delicate than you're making it out to be."
"Delicate?"
Alindra's voice was icy, carrying a weight of command that brooked no defiance.
"You've plotted against your queen, manipulated the council, and conspired with enemies of the Dominion.
There is nothing delicate about your betrayal, Saren." Saren's smile faded, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. Something hungry and desperate. "Do." "Betrayal," he said softly. "Is that how you see it?" Wyatt exchanged a nervous glance with Naira. He could tell. She was holding her breath, ready to act if things went south, but also acutely aware of just how badly outnumbered they were. Saren's guards stood with their weapons trained on the Queen, their expressions unreadable beneath their helmets. Alindra's own guards, now standing at the doorway, were clearly torn between their loyalty to their queen and the ramifications of crossing Saren, who held sway over much of the Lyon Council. "I see it as what it is," Alindra said, her voice steady and unyielding. "You have threatened the unity of our people, and that is something I cannot allow."
There was a beat of silence, and then Saren's mask of politeness slipped away entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating smirk.
"Then I suppose this is the end of your reign," he replied, his tone almost casual. "And the beginning of mine." With a swift, fluid motion, Saren drew his sidearm, the weapon humming ominously as it charged. His guards moved as one, raising their weapons in unison. Wyatt's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging as he realized this was it. There was no turning back, but Alindra was faster. She lunged forward, her blade flashing with lethal precision. Wyatt barely had time to register the movement before one of Saren's guards crumpled to the floor, a gash across his chest. The relay room exploded into chaos. Naira dove behind a console, dragging Wyatt down with her just as energy blasts whizzed overhead. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning circuitry, and the sounds of shouting, clashing metal, and the hum of energy weapons. Wyatt peered around the edge of the console, trying to make sense of the madness. Saren's guards were well-trained and heavily armed, their coordinated movements cutting through the chaos with ruthless efficiency. Alindra's guards fought back with a ferocity that matched their queen's resolve, but it was clear that they were at a disadvantage. In the center of the room, Alindra and Saren circled each other like predators, their eyes locked in a silent, deadly battle of wills. Saren's sidearm pulsed with energy, but Alindra's blade never wavered, her movements fluid and precise. "We have to help her!" Wyatt yelled, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "Yeah, but how?" Naira shot back, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. "We're engineers, Wyatt, not soldiers." Wyatt's mind raced, searching for something, anything that could tip the scales in their favor. Then, through the haze of panic, he remembered the relay station. The old, nearly defunct tech surrounding them was designed to interface with the station's emergency systems. "Naira," he said, his voice suddenly urgent, "can you access the auxiliary power controls from here?" Mara blinked, caught off guard by the question. What? Wyatt, this is not the time. Trust me, he interrupted, grabbing her arm. Can you do it? She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes narrowing in determination. Yeah, but it's going to take a minute. Wyatt peeked around the console again, his pulse racing. Alindra and Saren were locked in a deadly dance, each testing the other's defenses with precise strikes and parries. Saren was stronger, but Alindra was faster, her blade flashing like lightning as she deflected his attacks. Hurry! Wyatt urged, his voice barely above a whisper. Man. Mara's fingers flew over the console, her expression focused. I'm working on it, she muttered, her tone clipped. Wyatt forced himself to stay calm, to ignore the fear clawing at the edges of his mind. He wasn't a hero. He never had been, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing, not when everything was on the line. A shout from across the room drew his attention, and Wyatt's heart skipped a beat. One of Salfran's guards had broken through the Queen's defenses, raising his weapon to strike her from behind. Watch out! Wyatt shouted, the words leaving his mouth before he could think. Alindra reacted instantly, spinning on her heel and slashing upward with her blade. The guard's weapon clattered to the floor, and he stumbled back, clutching his bleeding arm. For a brief moment, Alindra's gaze met Wyatt's across the chaos. A fleeting connection that spoke of shared danger and silent understanding. Wyatt felt a strange mix of relief and dread, knowing that he had just painted a target on his back. Got it, Mara whispered, her eyes widening as the console beeped in confirmation. What now? Overload the auxiliary grid, Wyatt said, the plan coming together in his mind. If we can create a power surge, it should knock out their weapons, at least for a few seconds. Mara's eyes widened. That's insane, she muttered. But even as she spoke, her fingers moved over the controls, rerouting power to the relay station. Yeah, well, I'm open to better ideas, Wyatt replied, his voice tight with nerves. Mara let out a shaky breath. Nope, this is our best bad idea. As the power level spiked, Wyatt felt a faint hum in the air, a low, rising tension that made his skin tingle. He glanced at Mara, and she nodded, her expression grim. Do it, Wyatt said. Mara hit the final command, and the relay station erupted in a burst of blinding light. Wyatt felt a surge of energy ripple through the room, a pulse that made every nerve in his body buzz with electricity. He braced himself, hoping the plan would work. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the emergency lights kicked in, Wyatt saw exactly what he had hoped for. Saren's guards were disoriented, their weapons momentarily disabled by the power surge. Alindra seized the opening, her blade flashing as she cut down another of Saren's guards. Saren staggered back, his sidearm sparking uselessly in his hand. He cursed under his breath, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. Now's our chance, Wyatt muttered, rising from behind the console. He drew his blaster, his grip steady despite the adrenaline racing through his veins. Mara, cover me! Mara didn't argue. She just nodded, her own weapon at the ready. Wyatt moved forward, his eyes fixed on Saren. The Lion Lord turned to face him, his expression twisting into a snarl. You! Saren spat, his voice dripping with venom. You dare interfere in Leon affairs? I've never been great at following orders, Wyatt replied, his voice steady. He raised his blaster, aiming directly at Saren, and right now, I'm thinking I'll take my chances. For a moment, Saren's eyes flashed with rage, but then his expression shifted, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Foolish human, he hissed. You have no idea what you've... A gunshot rang out, cutting Saren off mid-sentence. He staggered, shock crossing his face as he clutched his side, blood seeping through his fingers. He turned, glaring at the source of the shot. Mira, who stood with her blaster raised, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes, Talk too much, Mira muttered, her voice barely audible. Saren's face twisted into a snarl, but before he could react, Alindra stepped forward, her blade raised. It's over, Saren, she said, her voice cold and final. The Leon Lord's expression shifted, the anger giving way to something almost resigned. Him. He met Alindra's gaze, and for a moment, there was something almost human in his eyes. An acknowledgement of defeat, and the realization of what he had lost. So be it, Saren whispered. With a single swift motion, Alindra struck. The room went silent, the only sound the faint hum of the emergency lights. Wyatt stood there, his breath caught in his chest, unable to process what had just happened. Alindra lowered her blade, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the lifeless form of the man who had betrayed her. "It's done," she said quietly, the words heavy with finality. Wyatt let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension drain from his body. He glanced at Megara, who looked as shell-shocked as he felt. They had done it. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. But Wyatt knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The relay room was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle. Alindra's remaining guards moved quickly, securing the area and tending to the wounded. Mara slumped against the console, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline wore off. Wyatt felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching everything from a distance, his mind still racing, replaying the events of the past few minutes over and over. "Wyatt," Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Did we actually pull that off?" Wyatt blinked, forcing himself to focus. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "We did." Mara let out a shaky laugh, her shoulders sagging in relief. "That's insane!" "Tell me about it," Wyatt muttered as they stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Alindra approached them, moving with the same grace and poise as always. But there was a heaviness in her steps, a weight that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a sincerity that took Wyatt by surprise. "Both of you. I would not have succeeded without your help." Wyatt felt a flicker of pride at her words. He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded, hoping that was enough. "What happens now?" Mara asked, her voice hesitant. Alindra's expression hardened, and Wyatt saw the determination in her eyes, the resolve of a queen who had faced down betrayal and survived. "Now," she said, "we rebuild. We bring Sauron's allies to justice, and we restore order to the council." "And what about us?" Wyatt asked, unable to hide the hint of apprehension in his voice. Alindra's gaze softened, and for a moment Wyatt thought he saw a trace of warmth in her eyes. "You have proven yourselves to be trustworthy allies," she said. "As long as you wish to remain on this station, you will have my protection." Wyatt let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," he said with a lopsided grin, "I guess that's one way to get a promotion." Mara rolled her eyes, but there was a faint smile on her lips. "You're impossible, you know that." "Yeah, but you love me anyway," Wyatt replied. The familiar banter was a welcome relief after everything they had just been through. Alindra watched them, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet sigh, she sheathed her blade and turned to leave. "Rest, both of you," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality. "There is much to be done, and I will need allies I can trust." As the door closed behind her, Wyatt and Mara stood in silence, the weight of everything that had just happened settling over them like a shroud. Wyatt didn't know what the future held or what kind of chaos lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The aftermath of Sakharin's betrayal left the space station in a tense and fragile state. The news of the Lord's attempted coup spread quickly, and rumors thrived in the shadows. Some whispered that the Queen's rule was still in jeopardy, while others speculated that Saturn had been only a pawn in a far larger conspiracy. Through it all, Wyatt and Megara tried to blend back into the station's daily routine, but they both knew their roles had changed irrevocably. Wyatt woke early, the remnants of uneasy dreams clinging to his mind. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, staring up at the ceiling of his small quarters. For a moment, he could still see Sauron's cold eyes and the flash of Alindra's blade. His fingers twitched as if reaching for the blaster he no longer held, and he shook his head to clear it. He wasn't a soldier, but he wasn't just a maintenance tech anymore either. The thought lingered as he dressed and made his way to the observation deck where Alindra had summoned him. When the door slid open, Wyatt found the Queen standing at the viewport, her back to him. The planet below the Lion homeworld was a serene swirl of blues and silvers, its atmosphere tinted by the light of two suns. "I thought you might need this," Wyatt said, holding out a steaming cup of synthetic coffee. Alindra turned slightly,
one eyebrow arching in curiosity. "And what exactly is that?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of humor. "Something to help with the exhaustion," Wyatt replied with a grin. "Trust me, you'll love it. Just don't ask what it's made of." Alindra regarded the cup with a mix of suspicion and amusement before taking it from his hand. She took a tentative sip, her expression remaining carefully neutral. Wyatt half expected her to grimace, but to his surprise, she took another sip, her eyes widening slightly. "Of carriage. It is unexpectedly pleasant," she said, her voice carrying the faintest note of approval. "You humans continue to surprise me." "Part of our charm," Wyatt said, shrugging. The Queen studied him for a moment, then turned back to the viewport. "You are wondering why I called you here," she said, her tone shifting to something more formal. "I figured it wasn't just for a coffee date," Wyatt replied, leaning against the railing. Alindra let out a quiet breath, her eyes never leaving the swirling clouds below. "The Council is in disarray," she said. "Saren's actions have shaken the foundations of our leadership, and many of my allies have been hesitant to show their support openly." Wyatt could hear the frustration and exhaustion beneath her composed exterior. He couldn't blame her. After everything that had happened, Alindra had every right to be tired, to be angry, but she wasn't letting it show. "Sounds like they're more concerned with politics than doing what's right," Wyatt muttered, his voice carrying more bitterness than he intended. Alindra's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment he thought he saw something like gratitude in her eyes. "You are more perceptive than you appear," she said softly. "But there is more to it than simple cowardice. Saren's faction has loyalists hidden among the Council, and if I move too quickly, it could incite further conflict." Wyatt frowned, his mind racing. "So what's your plan?" Alindra hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Then, with a quiet sigh, she spoke. "I must consolidate my power and prove to the Council that I have the station's loyalty. If I do not, they may attempt to depose me, or worse, seek an alliance with our enemies." Wyatt felt a chill run down his spine. "That's a hell of a tightrope to walk." "Yes," Alindra replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "and that is why I need you, Wyatt." The words took him by surprise, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. It felt surreal, almost absurd, that he, a human engineer with no political experience and a tendency to stumble into trouble, could be a key player in a lion power struggle. "You want my help?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I do," Alindra replied, turning to face him fully. There was a resolve in her eyes, an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You have proven yourself to be resourceful, loyal, and unconventional traits that are perhaps in short supply among my people." Wyatt chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Well, when you put it that way, how can I refuse?" Alindra's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "I would not ask if it were not important." There was something unspoken in her words, a weight of responsibility that Wyatt couldn't ignore. He knew this wasn't just about political maneuvering. It was about survival, for Alindra, and for her people. And maybe, just maybe, it was about building something better than what they had now. "All right," Wyatt said, his voice steady. "What do you need me to do?" Alindra's expression softened, and for a moment the mask of a queen fell away, revealing something more human beneath. "There is a vote in 2 days' time," she explained, "a vote that will determine the future of the Council. If I am to retain control, I must convince the undecided members that I am the best choice to lead." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "And how do I fit into that?" "There are those who remain loyal to Saren even after his death," Alindra said quietly. "If we can prove that they were complicit in his betrayal, it will shift the balance of power in my favor." Wyatt nodded slowly, understandings. "So you want me to dig up dirt on Sauron's allies?" "In a manner of speaking," Alindra replied. "You and Naira have already proven yourselves adept at navigating the station's networks. If anyone can find the information we need, it is you." Wyatt felt a rush of adrenaline at the thought of another covert mission. He glanced at Alindra, seeing the trust in her eyes, and felt something tighten in his chest, something he wasn't ready to name. "All right," he said with a grin, "let's do this." The next 2 days were a blur of covert operations, late-night data raids, and tense meetings with Naira in dark corners of the maintenance sector. Wyatt had never thought he'd find himself playing spy in a political drama,
But there he was, hacking into secure databases and eavesdropping on private conversations, like some kind of interstellar detective. With Mara's help, he managed to gather enough evidence to tie Saren's allies to a series of illegal transactions and backdoor deals. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to cast doubt on their loyalty and enough to give Alindra the lever she needed. On the day of the vote, the council chambers were packed with representatives, each wearing the traditional flowing robes of their station. The tension in the air was palpable, and Wyatt felt a nervous energy buzzing through him as he stood at the edge of the chamber, trying to blend in with the other staff members. Mara stood beside him, arms crossed and her expression wary. "You really think this is going to work?" she muttered, her voice barely audible. "It has to," Wyatt replied, his eyes fixed on the council members. "Otherwise, we're all screwed." As the council members took their seats, Alindra entered the chamber, her presence commanding and her expression calm. She moved with the confidence of a queen who knew exactly what was at stake, and Wyatt felt a flicker of pride at the sight. But as she took her place at the head of the chamber, Wyatt couldn't help but notice the hostile stares from Sakharin's former allies. It was clear that they weren't going to let Alindra's rise to power go unchallenged. The council leader called for the vote, and Wyatt held his breath, watching the representatives raise their hands in favor or opposition. The room was silent, the tension almost unbearable. Then it was done. The votes were tallied, and the council leader announced the results. Alindra had won. The chamber erupted in murmurs, some relieved, others angry. Wyatt let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, a grin spreading across his face. He turned to Mara, who looked equally stunned. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered, shaking her head. "We actually did it." Down. Wyatt's grin widened, but before he could respond, he saw Alindra approaching, her expression solemn. She stopped in front of him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "You did well, Wyatt," she said, her voice carrying a note of gratitude. "Couldn't have done it without you," Wyatt replied, trying to keep his voice steady. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of everything they had accomplished hanging between them. Wyatt felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation, as if they were standing on the edge of something new and uncertain. "You have proven yourself to be a valuable ally," Alindra said quietly, "and more than that, a friend." Wyatt felt his chest tighten at her words, unsure of what to say. But before he could find the right words, Alindra continued. "There is much work to be done," she said, her voice steady, "but I believe that together we can build a future where humans and lions are not enemies but allies." Wyatt smiled, warmth spreading through him. "I think I'd like that." Alindra's expression softened, and for a moment, the walls between them seemed to fade. There was something unspoken in her eyes, something that went beyond politics and alliances, but she didn't say it, not yet. Instead, she offered him a nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of trust and respect, and Wyatt understood what it meant. It wasn't the end of their journey, far from it. There were still challenges ahead, still battles to be fought and alliances to be forged. But for now, they had won a hard-fought victory, and that was enough. As the council chambers began to empty, Wyatt and Mara exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through. They had started as two engineers trying to keep their heads down, but they had become something more, part of something bigger than themselves. "Come on," Mara said, her voice light. "I think we've earned ourselves a drink." Wyatt chuckled, feeling a sense of relief and hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. "I think we have." As they made their way out of the council chambers, Wyatt glanced back at Alindra, who was speaking with her advisors. Their eyes met, and she offered him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a promise of friendship, of trust, and of a future worth fighting for. As Wyatt walked away, he couldn't help but feel like he had found his place in the universe. Right here, among the stars, standing beside a queen who was more than just a leader. She was his ally, his friend, and maybe, just maybe, something more. But that was a story for another day.